My name is Ranya Sharma, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. Today, I will be presenting our project, User Awareness and Behaviors Concerning Encrypted DNS Settings in Web Browsers. So currently, the encrypted DNS ecosystem is increasingly becoming a place where various internet stakeholders try to vie for control through technical protocol design. And really, these design choices affect market consolidation and power, corporate visibility into and control over user data, and user privacy on the internet. And at the end of the day, humans are impacted the most by these decisions, which is really why it's essential to study their awareness and knowledge of these settings. Currently, many major browsers and operating system vendors have recently deployed encrypted DNS functionality, and particular configurations of these settings are often enabled by default. So in many cases, default encrypted DNS settings have implications for performance and privacy. And an example of this is with Firefox, because until recently, Firefox sent all of a user's DNS queries to Cloudflare through their default DNS setting, which really just creates privacy vulnerabilities since one resolver is sitting on heaps of user data. So our study confirmed that most users are unaware of these new technologies and the subsequent implications. For some brief background, the domain name system, also known as DNS, maps human-readable names to IP addresses, and DNS queries are conventionally unencrypted, which leaves queries and responses vulnerable to eavesdropping and manipulation. So protocols such as DNS over TLS, known as DOT, and DNS over HTTPS, known as DOH, have emerged to encrypt queries so that they're no longer vulnerable to those third parties. The research questions that we studied are users aware of encrypted DNS settings in browsers and devices? What encrypted DNS settings do users have enabled? When shown encrypted DNS settings for different browsers, which settings do users select? And when the technical aspects of these systems are explained to users and they just really have a greater knowledge of what DNS is and how encrypted DNS functions, how do their choices of settings change? So we studied encrypted DNS settings in Brave, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Opera, and the Android mobile operating system. So say, for instance, after hearing about what encrypted DNS is, somebody wants to try enabling encrypted DNS in their Chrome browser. This is what they would do. They would navigate to the Settings tab. Then they would click on Privacy and Security. They'd click on Security and scroll down to the encrypted DNS setting, which is called Use Secure DNS. They can toggle the setting to enable it. And they can see the privacy policy for a resolver if they click on it. And if they choose to enter a custom resolver like google.com in an incorrect format, they get an error. However, once formatted correctly, as demonstrated, the setting will work fine. And as this demonstration shows, the setting page is not easily accessible and is frequently buried under many tabs, which significantly impacts the user experience, and very little explanation about the setting is also given, which is important to note. As demonstrated here, the interfaces between browsers are strikingly varied, and we find that Brave, Chrome, and Edge all operate similarly, and that they refer to encrypted DNS as secure DNS. So if a user makes no changes, the browser uses the user's default DNS resolver. It falls back to sending unencrypted DNS queries if the encrypted DNS resolver is unavailable. Firefox and Opera, on the other hand, refer to encrypted DNS as DNS over HTTPS, and Firefox's default behavior is to use encrypted DNS with Cloudflare as the default resolver. And Opera actually disables encrypted DNS by default, and when encrypted DNS is enabled, Opera uses Cloudflare as the default resolver. Another interesting thing to note about Opera is that they are the only provider that explicitly mentions that DOH uses third-party services. Between resolvers, Mozilla actually operates a trusted recursive resolver program, and that they ensure that DOH providers recommended by Firefox best protect privacy by not over-collecting and sharing data. Some of the resolvers shown in these interfaces actually also offer additional features, such as blocking malware or adult content. So onto our study. Our study consisted of a two-part survey, and we recruited participants via Prolific and compensated them for their time. Our first screening survey, which was the initial survey, we asked 800 participants about their use of different popular web browsers, and based on their responses to these questions, we assigned participants to subgroups determined by the browsers that they reported using at least once a week. After assigning participants to subgroups according to browser, we invited up to 50 participants from each group to participate in a second, longer survey, which was our main survey. Our main survey had 184 participants, and the structure of it was as follows. First, we asked participants if they had heard of DNS prior to the study and if they knew what DNS did, really just trying to gauge their preliminary understanding. Then we randomly assigned participants to an anonymized version of actual DNS settings that can be found in browsers, and here N represents the number of participants assigned to each browser. And rather than simply showing them a screenshot of their assigned interface, we embedded interactive versions of the browser directly into the survey so that participants could interact with them in the same way that they would in their own browser, really just trying to simulate the real experience. After interacting with the settings screen, we asked participants questions about their rationale for choosing different options, as well as just their understanding and perceptions of the different options. We also showed participants an interactive version of the private DNS setting on Android and asked about the setting and what they would choose. Then we described the DNS and checked participants' understanding through a multiple choice question about the basic functionality of DNS, and we explained in more detail how the specific settings work. Given this additional information, we also asked their thoughts on the setting. After that, we showed participants the interactive encrypted DNS settings screen that they saw earlier in the survey and asked them once again to decide what options they would choose and why. And really, this just allowed us to understand how respondents change their settings after gaining a high-level understanding of what encrypted DNS does and the benefits that it provides. Finally, we asked participants to report on the current DOH settings in a browser that they regularly use, and we asked about their experience with these settings and how they manipulated the settings. And the browser that we asked participants to look at depended on their responses to the screening survey. So if for some reason a participant did not have access to the browser subgroup that they were assigned to, we reassigned the participant to another browser that they did have access to. So the first result that we look at is, are users aware of encrypted DNS settings? And what we found is 73% of all participants actually reported having heard of DNS prior to the survey. However, of the participants who reported having heard of DNS, 59.9% had heard of encrypted DNS, but when participants who claimed to know the purpose of DNS were asked to describe it in their own words, fewer than half actually mentioned the DNS as being responsible for translating domain names to IP addresses, and there were various misconceptions of its purpose, including identifying computers on a network or connecting a device to the internet, which is not the actual purpose of DNS. So 79.4% of participants had the default settings enabled in their browsers, which typically meant that participants' browsers were opportunistically encrypting their DNS queries. And no participants reported correctly configuring a custom DNS resolver in their browser. When shown the anonymized browser interfaces for encrypted DNS, 71.7% of participants continued to use the default settings shown to them. And really, this finding just illustrates and underscores the importance of how browsers and mobile service providers configure their defaults. When participants enabled encrypted DNS but did not go with the default setting, they were much more likely to choose a setting that was listed in this, to use a resolver that was listed in the setting rather than specifying a custom resolver. And we found that Cloudflare was by far the most popular. As mentioned, no participant entered a custom DNS resolver that would have actually resulted in their queries being encrypted. Participants entered queries such as McAfee or Google.com or 1.1.1, none of these which were formatted correctly. One of the greatest findings from our survey was that we found a very strong connection between the name of the setting and the perceived impact. And as discussed earlier, the two names of settings in browsers are Secure DNS and DNS over HTTPS. So with the name Secure DNS, we found that participants tended to associate it with safety and security. So one participant said, the wording makes it sound like enabling DNS would make my browser more secure. Another said, I don't know a lot about it, but it seems like an extra step of protection. Really, they were just associating it with security, safety, and protection. However, there's a lot of name confusion with the name DNS over HTTPS. We found that interfaces that label the setting with the technical name DNS over HTTPS cause confusion because instead of interpreting the name as meaning DNS using the HTTPS protocol, they interpreted DOH as meaning using DNS instead of HTTPS. So of the participants who saw the Firefox or Opera interfaces that label the setting in this way, 10.6% actually mentioned an incorrect interpretation of the setting name as part of the reason for choosing the setting option that they did, which we actually found was staggeringly high to have this name confusion. One participant said, "I have no earthly idea what DNS is, while I at least have a passing familiarity with HTTPS. Another said, "From the little I know, I believe that HTTPS is more secure than DNS." And really, this just emphasizes the issues of technical jargon and the necessity of explaining these concepts to users to avoid that confusion. So, after having been provided a description of what the DNS is used for and what encrypted DNS does, 37% of participants chose to actually modify their setting in some way. And 30 participants reversed their choice, with an equal number choosing to disable the setting that they had previously enabled or enable the setting that they had previously disabled. So based off our findings, we make the following recommendations. The first is to provide a basic primer on DNS function to explain the privacy risks and the trade-offs associated with each setting, really just to give users a greater idea of what encrypted DNS is, what DNS is, so that they know what they're doing when they're modifying the settings. Next is to be thoughtful of technical protocol terminology, and this was really underscored with the DNS over HTTPS name confusion. So by being more cognizant of the terminology that's used, hopefully some of this confusion can be ameliorated. And next is to provide users with the necessary format to select a custom resolver, really just adding instructions, guidelines, and warnings for more clarity so that it can be configured in the way that a user intends. So in conclusion, we study user understanding and awareness of encrypted DNS settings in 4 browsers in the Android mobile operating system. We suggest practical recommendations for designers and policymakers based on our results, and we identify that work is needed in several areas, including to improve user awareness about the privacy implications of DNS, to provide users with information to better understand the implications of how encrypted DNS is configured, and to design setting interfaces that make these options intuitive for users to customize. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.